My wife was unfaithful to me, but not with a neighbor, best friend, or someone from the gym. No, it's not a typical affair. Let me calmly share this with you all. My wife cheated on me with my stepfather. I loved my mother until her last day. She was my everything. We always supported each other in our projects, at least until her passing 3 years ago, leaving a huge void in my heart that I thought I could fill with my wife, Melissa. However, my mother had one pseudo-negative side. She didn't fully appreciate her husband, Richard. You see, Richard is my stepfather. They married about 10 years ago, and I must admit he wasn't a bad father figure. He taught me how to drive and calculate taxes. I start with the positive to ease into the next revelation. Melissa's behavior became a bit strange. I reminisced a lot about my mom, and according to Melissa, there were whole days when I seemed depressed. Coping with such a loss isn't easy, and I don't think I can be blamed. Now, Richard becomes relevant because one day, I was using Melissa's phone to respond to her work messages. Nothing inappropriate happened. It was the typical movie scene. She was in the bath and got a work text. Knowing her business well, I replied, even warning her about it. While replying, Melissa received another text, and since the notification popped up, I ended up reading it. It was from a certain Rick. The message started with, "Hey Millie." Millie is a nickname I gave Melissa when we first met, and I'm the only one who calls her that. The fact that Rick had no last name in his contact profile caught my attention with a red flag. Feeling uneasy, I opened the message to dispel doubts. What I found left me paralyzed with horror. Rick apologized for writing at that time, expressing his inability to stop thinking about Melissa. Examining the rest of the conversation revealed deleted messages and another one-time view message. Trembling with fear, my worst fears came true. Melissa was having an affair with somebody else. As evident from the beginning, you might already have a notion of the person involved. Who exactly was this Rick? Well, was it the same individual? I knew it was Richard, my stepfather. That's when I devised a plan to confirm it. Initially, I messaged the so-called Rick, instructing him to meet me the next day in a specific part of town. He had to be seated at a designated table wearing a green shirt, details he didn't quite comprehend initially. Despite the risk, I insisted he comply, deleting our earlier exchanged messages to erase any evidence. The next day, I would be confronting the individual without him realizing it concerned me. It gave me a lot of courage. I'm not a violent person, but given the situation, I dislike being perceived as a fool. The next day, armed with my best arguments, I positioned myself in a public place to confront the scoundrel making advances at my wife. However, the plan backfired when I arrived at the designated spot, only to find a person in a green shirt. That's right, you guessed it. It was Richard. He looked somewhat uneasy, perhaps aware that his actions were wrong, but seemingly indifferent from the start. I decided to play with the situation a bit. I encountered him on the street, asking what he was doing there. I attempted to keep him from noticing, but he seemed to be sweating excessively. He mentioned waiting for somebody, but provided no further details, and swiftly left the place, possibly fearing a confrontation. I swear I don't know how I restrained the urge to confront him physically. I recognize the need to keep a cool head in such scenarios, and although I don't want to think the worst, at least, well, I did go home with an uneasy conscience. That night, I questioned Melissa about her relationship with Richard, and she immediately grew uncomfortable and defensive. She avoided my questions and told me she did not understand what I was even talking about. Well, I told her right off the bat that I had been suspecting things like that. Richard was seeing somebody else. I said I had no problem with it, as he deserves to move on with his life too. It just hurt a little that he wasn't confident enough to tell me since we were so close. Instead of telling me to try to talk to him about it, Melissa told me to leave it alone, as it was his private life. And if he did not comment on it, maybe it was out of embarrassment or something. So, it's best to just keep it to himself. Well, I went ahead and insisted a bit and ended up stating that I asked her about her relationship with Richard so that she would be the one to ask him about it, and sighed. I felt a little broken by all the lies being told to my face, so I told myself that if I was going to try something bold, I would at least need hard evidence. I started to map out a plan regarding the phones. Update. Regrettably, the plan unfolded with unsettling success. Upon scrutinizing fabricated messages, I discovered the undeniable truth that both my wife and stepfather were engaged in an affair right under my nose. Life's cruelties found their way to me, and it was my turn to bear the consequences. I captured the damning conversations through screenshots and opted to confront them both. I arranged a modest dinner for the three of us, intending to expose them as the traitors they were, those treacherous individuals. The dinner was tense. They were unusually silent, suspecting that I was privy to more than I should be. After dessert, I initiated the conversation, asserting, "Well, I think it's time we talked. Let's address this big old elephant in the room." This prompted desperate responses from both. While Melissa appeared quizzical and confused, avoiding an objective answer, Richard seemed crestfallen, resembling a scolded child. I insisted they provide an explanation, but they continued evading for quite a while. It wasn't until I presented the evidence that they finally confessed. Here's the summary of their statements. Richard began by expressing remorse. He apologized, acknowledging that he didn't intend to hurt me. He mentioned the vulnerability and impressionability of people, emphasizing how sometimes individuals find themselves in a dark abyss. He clarified that he wasn't making excuses and acknowledged that good people can end up committing despicable acts. The conversation shifted to my mother, and I couldn't contain my anger. I interrupted him, losing my temper and almost resorting to physical violence. Melissa intervened, her interjection adding to my frustration as it was more blunt and rant-like. She discussed how our faltering marriage led Richard, with experience in the field, to assist with various issues, initially offering his point of view and later transitioning from anger. I felt nauseous, but I had to suppress it to avoid appearing weak. They attempted to justify their infidelity and claimed they would make amends, as if such damage could be repaired. I started yelling, and since the neighbors heard everything, the entire block fell into spectral silence. I'd never felt this furious, and had we not removed the knives from the table, I feared that something serious could have transpired. I document all this, understanding that anonymity prevails amid a sea of tears from everyone involved. We agreed that everyone would leave the premises independently, leaving me alone in the house that night. I wasn't certain where Melissa spent the night, but the thought of her being with Richard made me a bit anxious, though given the circumstances, I didn't consider it entirely plausible either. Update. This marked the commencement of a negative phase for me. Firstly, due to my poor emotional state, my work performance suffered, jeopardizing my job. To compound matters, rumors of infidelity circulated within and outside the offices in this small town, where any rumor becomes national news. Given that many people know me and knew my mother, knowing what happened is a profound shame. While I recognize that Melissa and Richard might be facing difficulties too, I honestly couldn't care less. Melissa attempted to contact me a couple of times by phone. It happened twice in a row, but I promptly ended both calls in anger, and afterward, she refrained from further contact. Richard's approach, however, took a different but equally unsatisfactory turn. Out of the blue, he came to the house, urging me to reconsider forgiving Melissa. He claimed she was young and impressionable, placing the blame squarely on himself. I rejected his apologies and insulted him, emphasizing that he had not only offended me, but also tarnished the memory of my mother. I made it clear that I appreciated him being in a place where he and Melissa belonged, the depths of despair. The guy started crying, and I remained indifferent, reflecting on how long they had been engaging in their actions right under my nose, which sickened me. Feeling the need to address the situation before it took a toll on my sanity, I confided in an old friend, Lola, who had introduced Melissa and me. Lola shared my outrage, even apologizing for the introduction, acknowledging the great wrong it put on me. She hadn't spoken to Melissa since and was hesitant to do so, despite their close friendship. However, she asked a rather curious question about shared assets within the marriage. We hadn't signed prenuptial agreements, a decision that seemed less than smart in hindsight, especially since Melissa initially suggested signing them. I pondered whether Melissa would be remorseful, willing to give me everything in a divorce scenario. However, my concern shifted to the house we lived in, which belongs to Melissa's family. Originally owned by her aunt, they allowed us to stay there indefinitely. I feared Melissa might remember this information and evict me. Under these circumstances, it would be miserable for her to throw me out on the street. But considering her betrayal, anything could happen, At this point, maybe the recent calls she made were just for that purpose. Update. Certain aspects of my life must progress for improvement, either forward or upward. In my case, it's a bit more specific, and it goes by the name Colombia. I arrived in Colombia a few months ago, and before delving into my experiences in the country, I want to explain why I made such a radical decision. Remember the situation with my ex-wife and stepfather? Well, following that, a little less than a year ago, I sank into a profound depression, the worst I had ever witnessed in my life. There were moments when I contemplated the most dreadful fate, self-damage. However, with the support of my friends and my psychologist, I managed to navigate through it. In discussing changes and acknowledging that I hadn't seemingly overcome my mother's grief, I recognized the need for radical changes in my life. After much meditation and a bit of introspection, I felt that establishing a new residence in the city would be counterproductive. As I mentioned, the town was pleasant but small, where everyone knows each other. So, I was encouraged to move to another city, and I did. I stayed in a nearby city for at least a couple of months, long enough for my new job to provide some valuable contacts. Among them was a coworker who recommended an international assistance website. Initially, I didn't grasp it well, but after some research, I learned that it was the equivalent of a golden opportunity. What do I mean? Well, it's a platform where people from various parts of the world can work in different countries, immersing themselves in diverse cultures and customs while remaining productive. Initially, the idea seemed somewhat whimsical, but gradually, it caught my attention. There were several places I considered: Russia, Australia, Egypt, Brazil, Romania. However, in the end, I chose Colombia. Latin America was a region rich in culture, often referred to as our neighbors to the south, as my mother used to say. Her influence, having lived there for a year in her youth, significantly impacted my decision. She described it as one of the most beautiful experiences of her life. So, why not? Alongside my job in the new city, I secured an online position that allowed me to work more flexibly from anywhere. I might as well keep working as long as I have a laptop and an internet connection. Consequently, I decided to take a significant leap and make the necessary arrangements to move to Colombia. To afford it, I sold many of my belongings and rid myself of almost everything from my marriage. Everything that belonged to me from that chapter in my life was able to leave through the metaphorical big door. I opted to stay out of the public eye for a few weeks, cutting off all contacts and ignoring communication from both Melissa and Richard, who persistently called or texted. I'm uncertain if ghosting is considered good practice, but in my case, it was the healthiest thing I could resort to without going insane. Eventually, the calls ceased, though occasionally I would receive a missed call from them. The ironic part is that it always involved a long-distance communication issue. They never agreed to show up at the door of my residence, though I doubt I would have opened it anyway. And that's how I headed to Colombia. I felt a sense of loss for my previous job, but I also considered that venturing to a place so far away, with different customs, and even a distinct national language, could bring positive changes with numerous possibilities at hand. I was a new man, ready to conquer the world. I just needed to be introduced to that world, and if only they knew that I coped quite well with the language issue. Thanks to my mother and my school Spanish classes, I managed to get through them, receiving only passing grades in all my reports. Of course, I had to refine my language skills, but within a few months, I was proficient enough to place orders at the grocery store. The job I secured involved being an assistant in a law firm, handling calls and redirecting cases. Although initially challenging due to the language barrier, it would become more bearable with the guidance of my superiors and the recurring conversation patterns. Update. I was highly preoccupied during my time in Colombia, establishing a new life. However, there are always lingering ghosts from the past. Despite thinking I had moved on from my ex-wife and stepfather, they resurfaced. Interestingly, an old friend informed me that Melissa, currently entangled in several economic conflicts, is spreading rumors that her husband abandoned her penniless abroad, living a luxurious life without fulfilling her rightful support. Contrary to her claims, we never finalized the divorce. Legally, we remain connected. She asserts I ignore her calls, portraying her destitution as the result of her supposedly wicked husband. In reality, I had nothing to do with her departure, before she caused herself more damage. Surprisingly, she has embraced a more radical religious path, becoming evangelical or something similar. From what I understand, she's one of those religious individuals who criticize others while believing they're saints despite their past transgressions. She's just one of those people who believe repentance absolves them of past misdeeds, and goes further, pretending to humiliate me for her wrongs and my personal growth. What does she even get to pretend? That I should take care of her and provide everything she needs after all the damage she's done? I'm sorry, but I'm not that naive. My friend informed me that she even claimed I insulted and offended her about various personal matters. My friends countered by telling others that Melissa is fabricating lies to tarnish my reputation for something she did. All of this infuriates me. However, what keeps me most curious is that Richard does not make an appearance in any of the stories I tell. I haven't heard from him in a long time. Since I blocked him, and he wasn't much of a social networker, I saw him less. Recently, I noticed he hadn't posted anything, deepening the mystery. I thought he blocked me, but no. Many asked me about him for the same issue. I neither worry nor care about Richard. On a more positive note, I've been doing well. Initially working as a legal firm assistant, I faced challenges and ended up working at a supermarket with a demanding schedule. While the pay was good initially, the workload became overwhelming. Eventually, I climbed the corporate ladder, even becoming a branch manager, surprising many due to my short time there. Currently, I maintain a manageable schedule, allowing me time for personal pursuits on weekends. I've met a couple of girls, dated, and embraced the single life in Colombia. Despite not making significant progress in Thatrilionagard, my social interactions remain casual. Overcoming my mother's issues is delicate, and though I feel I fell short, I strive daily to make her proud from a distance. Update. The world is a collection of coincidences, and I find myself confronted with the news of Richard's passing. It has been 3 years since our conflict unfolded, and just yesterday, I was reflecting on it in my writing. Today, a friend informed me that Richard was discovered dead in Greece. Apparently, he embarked on a personal journey, having relocated to the area long ago, adopting a lifestyle akin to mine and dedicating himself to the sea. I won't pass judgment because, as I mentioned, he followed a path similar to mine. However, I can't help but find it somewhat amusing. I acknowledge that, post-conflict, he severed ties with Melissa, leaving her abandoned as well. Rumors are circulating that Melissa is not only unfaithful, but also actively sabotaging the lives of men she's involved with, predicting that anyone connected to her will end up out of the country. From a certain perspective, it sounds almost comical, but that's not the focal point now. Yes, Richard has passed away, and his burial is scheduled for tomorrow. Some of his family members express a desire for me to attend, but they don't fully grasp my decision if I choose not to. They know me quite well, understanding it's not my place. Despite his significant faults, he was a regular person like any of us. While I don't forgive him for his actions, I can't regard everything as settled with his departure from this world. In therapy sessions, there was extensive discussion about resentment and revenge. I transitioned from harboring active hatred for these individuals to adopting a more permissive stance. I mean, it's not worth getting overly angry about it. Although Melissa's negative comments behind my back resonate with me, every story reaches a satisfying conclusion eventually. With regards to Richard's relatives, I offered my condolences and wished them success in their endeavors. They reciprocated the same for me, expressing apologies that seemed misplaced as they weren't the ones directly involved in the actions or responsible for making amends in the first place. Update. Having some free time now, after the ordeal I went through, I can finally sit down and narrate the events leading to its conclusion. First, I'll explain my absence, as my lawyer advised against revealing part of this situation until the trial concluded. And now, with the verdict delivered, I can share it all. To hell with Melissa. She is the most despicable, vile, manipulative, and conflictive being I've ever encountered. She achieved the impossible, making me wish her well to hell. In essence, all our past relationships ended with her becoming my biggest enemy after the concluded trial. Let me delve into more detail since, as I mentioned, I now have the time after 2 long months. Finally, the victor gets to tell the story. After Richard's pass away, Almost all the assets he owned became Melissa's, as per his will made years ago. Amid his frenzy of spoiling Melissa during our relationship behind my back, Richard had this peculiar inclination, quote, to be part of her life in ways unknown to me, like giving her gifts or accompanying her on errands, always under the excuse of spending time with his daughter-in-law, who, during that time, audaciously put Melissa in his will. And guess what? He gave her all the assets, feeling it would be a help to her regardless of our marriage's outcome. A man's mind in the throes of passion can be a confused and erratic space. The affair began when I found out about the division of these assets, informed by one of Richard's nephews about everything that would be Melissa's property. Truth be told, Richard had quite a few things to his credit. I'm talking about cars, a couple of houses, an apartment, and even a farm outside the state. We all agreed she did not deserve it. Moreover, I was told that Richard himself had regretted his will, but let time go by during his stay in Greece, never thinking of amending it. Everyone said what he had left would be mine, and it bothered me that Melissa would just take it all. But something interesting would change everything. In the same way Richard allowed the modification of his will, not having signed the divorce with Melissa would, in theory, make the holder of 50% of his property. That's when I consulted my lawyer. I won't say his name. I'll just say he is perhaps one of the people I fear most for his intelligence. A divorce and marital dispute lawyer, one of the sharpest and shrewdest, with an almost 100% success rate. That's when I initiated a joint property settlement by marriage. Later, I learned Melissa sought my lawyer but couldn't afford him. He's not cheap, but I decided to invest my savings for a more secure outcome. That's when I learned something depressing. Melissa got into this new religion for financial convenience, doing terribly in her decision-making and fighting tooth and nail to claim everything in Richard's will. While I could have a solid basis regarding the assets, for it was clearly stipulated that she would own the whole thing, my lawyer appealed to one little detail: infidelity. Due to a violation of the marital agreement and the absence of signed prenups, there had to be an equitable distribution of assets. So we took care of that to prevent Melissa from having a chance to win. You should have seen her face when they gave the verdict. She was red as a tomato and almost regretful of everything she did. It's been a few weeks now, and the results shocked me by how grim it was. Melissa lost everything in the blink of an eye. How? No idea. My lawyer said it was amazing how someone could handle her newfound fortune so poorly, and I feel like I dodged a bullet by separating from her. Of course, the divorce was discussed right after the split, meaning she could no longer argue for my part of the deal. I admit my time in Colombia was amazing, but returning with heavy pockets is a more rewarding experience. No one speaks to Melissa nowadays, and her religious friends only speak to her out of politeness, leaving me with the moral satisfaction that eventually karma will exist for those who damaged you. Second story. Allow me to share my tale. I'm Emery, and I fell in love with Lila during our teenage years. We tied the knot at the age of 20, eagerly anticipating the beginning of our life together. However, a sense of incompleteness always lingered. I had forsaken college to work and support my young wife, yet the unfulfilled dream of completing my degree persisted in my thoughts. Determined to address this, I opted to return to school part-time and accomplish what I had started. The joy of discovering we were expecting a child added a new dimension to our lives. With impending parenthood, the pressure to complete my degree intensified. I aspired to provide the best possible future for our family. Max, our son, entered the world just as I commenced my final year of college. The schedule was demanding, working as a store stocker from 3 a.m. to 7 a.m., followed by a full-time administrative job at the police department from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Tuesdays involved classes from 5:30 p.m. to 10 p.m., and Saturdays from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. It was challenging, but I remained resolute to make it succeed. Lila, employed as a nurse's aide at a local hospital, worked from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. Fortunately, my mother lived a mere 10-minute drive away from our jobs and school, ensuring that Max was in good hands. Though a strenuous period, we provided unwavering support to each other throughout. Update. Over the preceding weekend, Lila and I clashed intensely. She was dissatisfied that I refused to take a break from studying to spend time with her and our son. Ongoing criticism of my work and school commitments had strained our relationship. We hadn't been in bed for 2 months, and on this specific Monday evening, tensions reached a breaking point. Amid fact-checking a research paper I completed over the weekend, due the following Tuesday evening, Lila provoked fights and created a scene. Frustrated, I told her to shut up and quit acting like a child. Her unexpected response stunned me. Looking me in the eye, she declared, "I hate you, and I'm in love with someone else." In complete shock, we argued for hours until Lila finally admitted the truth. She had been emotionally involved with a janitor at the hospital where she worked as a nurse's aide. Unbelievably, what began innocently with compliments and lunch dates in the cafeteria escalated quickly. She was bad-mouthing me and even kissing this guy behind my back. This revelation shattered me. My world crumbled, and I couldn't comprehend how the woman I loved betrayed me in such a way. I felt like my entire life was a lie. Deciding to leave, I returned to the living room with my suitcase, walked past her without a word. Despite her taunts and questions like, "Running back to mommy?" I set the suitcase in the driveway, went back inside and fetched her purse. Holding it out to her, I instructed her to leave. Stunned, she refused. So I gently picked her up, threw her over my shoulder, and carried her outside to the hood of the car. She was too shocked to resist as I went back inside, locked the door, and held the deadbolt firmly. Despite her attempts to re-enter, she eventually left to stay at her parents' place, informing them of our separation without revealing the real reason. That night felt endless, and I had to inform both my jobs of a family emergency, resulting in my absence the next day. Exhaustion overcame me, and I eventually drifted off to sleep. Update. I woke up at 7 this morning, my mind already consumed with thoughts of minimizing contact with Lila, my soon-to-be ex-wife. The situation between us had been escalating, and I knew I needed to act swiftly before things got messier. I called my mother to ask if she could watch our son for the day, but she sounded worried, questioning why the boy wasn't with us already. After dropping off my son at my mother's, I went directly to the office of a lawyer friend of my family, Mr. Douglas. Having known him well and trusted him since he went to school with my father, I explained the situation and asked for his help in filing for divorce as soon as possible. Mr. Douglas patiently listened and suggested I take some time to think it over, but I was resolute. I wanted to complete the divorce papers that day. He agreed to help, assuring they would be ready by day's end. I promised to pick them up and file them with the clerk's office myself. Leaving the office, a sense of relief washed over me. Finally, I was taking control of my life and making the decisions I needed to make. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I was determined to see it through. I went to work, returned home, showered, and had breakfast with my son and sister. Later that day, Lila called, seeking arrangements to see our son. She was angry and confrontational, insisting on taking our son for the weekend. I refused, suggesting we meet on Sunday at a local park. Lila hung up on me. Heading to work at the police department, I couldn't shake the unease from my conversation with Lila. I decided to take action, going to the clerk's office to file for divorce. Later that day, a coworker informed me the papers were ready to be served to Lila at her workplace. I called a deputy I knew and asked him to serve the papers to Lila at work, and he agreed to do so the next day. Lila returned to work after our phone call, and her janitor chatted with her throughout the day. They couldn't have lunch or meet that evening because he claimed he had to attend something with one of his kids. Lila, under the impression he was divorced with 3 children, went to her parents' house after work. Later that night, she called me 3 times, but I hung up each time I realized it was her calling. One day around noon, Mr. Douglas entered the nurse's station and asked for Lila. When she came forward, he loudly declared, "Mrs. Lila, you are being sued for divorce due to infidelity." Shocked, Lila fell to the ground, and the hall supervisor, Alex, rushed to her aid. Lila was engulfed by a wave of shame and guilt as the gravity of her actions dawned on her. She understood that Emery would never forgive her, unable to fathom how she had allowed it all to unfold. Mr. Douglas lifted her into a chair, and despite Alex's attempts to calm her, it took a while for her to regain composure. My wife, nearing the end of her shift, received a call to meet the hospital administrator in her office, leaving her terrified, fearing her outburst had been reported. Upon entering the administrator's office, the door abruptly slammed shut, and she was promptly fired. Imagine the look on her face. Priceless! They instructed her not to return to the property. I guess she won't be mixing business with pleasure anymore, huh? To add to it, her final paycheck would be mailed to her. As it turned out, someone had witnessed the affair in the parking lot and reported it. The news of the divorce papers had circulated around the hospital, leading to the janitor being fired and escorted off the property an hour earlier. The scandal's news spread like wildfire within the hospital, leaving my wife feeling as if everyone knew. She left the hospital, heading straight to her parents' house, revealing only our separation without providing details. I sat at the dinner table with my son, savoring a tranquil evening at home. Reflecting on the day's events, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The deputy had informed me of my wife's infidelity and her subsequent firing from the hospital. I must admit, hearing about the janitor's termination was also quite satisfying, given his involvement in the scandal. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, interrupting my thoughts. I got up to answer it, greeted by a heavily pregnant woman struggling to stand. She sought my wife Lila, but I informed her that Lila no longer lived with me. Confirming I was Lila's husband and had served her with divorce papers earlier that day, the woman, the janitor's wife, explained the hospital incident. Horrified by the details of my wife's affair and the undisclosed house, I wished I could have taken action against him. She asked me where Lila was, and I told her she was with her parents. After assuring me she only wanted to talk to Lila and reveal the truth, she asked for directions to Lila's parents' house. Before leaving, the woman also complimented me on my parenting skills, acknowledging me as a wonderful father to my son still at the table. Watching her leave, I couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness and betrayal. However, as a man, I knew I had to be strong for my son and move forward with the divorce. Update. It transpired that my wife, Lila, was entangled in a disturbing game orchestrated by the janitor and his associates. They maintained a tally, aiming to bed as many married women as possible within a mere 90 days. Lila became the janitor's third conquest, and shockingly, he engaged with a fourth woman on the same night he had an encounter with one of his children. I was repulsed and infuriated by what I had learned. The house mentioned was, in reality, a rented space where these men took the women they were involved with. When the janitor's wife discovered the truth, he returned home under the influence, tearfully confessing in an attempt to reconcile. Lila was astonished upon learning about it, and the janitor's wife confronted her, recounting how she witnessed me caring for our son alone because Lila was acting selfish and foolish. Lila lost control, breaking into tears, while the janitor's wife walked away, leaving her in a catatonic state. My in-laws checked on her after hearing the car depart. She was practically unresponsive. They brought her inside, contemplating whether to take her to the emergency room when she began to speak incoherently. My father-in-law suspected she might be on some form of stimulant. My father-in-law, a good man hurt by the entire situation, couldn't fathom his daughter cheating on her husband. Conversely, my mother-in-law, as always, placed blame on me for the entire ordeal. I couldn't tolerate my mother-in-law and was relieved to be free of her. It was a challenging circumstance, but as a man, I recognized the need to care for my son and move beyond this chaos. I experienced hurt and anger, yet I also felt a sense of relief in finally uncovering the truth. It marked the beginning of my journey to healing from the betrayal inflicted upon me. Update. Later that day, Lila's father called to update me, expressing concern that she remained unresponsive, neglecting personal care, and raising safety fears. Shockingly, he had the audacity to suggest I visit her. Seriously? I couldn't care less about her. After her betrayal, cheating, and shattering of my trust, I couldn't muster an ounce of sympathy. She created her problems, and now she can deal with them. Without a second thought, I rejected his plea. I had no interest in seeing her or getting entangled in her mess. Good riddance. I advised Lila's father to seek help for her and assured him that I'd permit her to see our son once she pulled herself together. It was a tough decision, but I recognized the need to prioritize my son's well-being over Lila's at that point. Hopefully, Lila would seek the necessary assistance, and we could eventually co-parent our son in a healthy manner. But for the time being, I needed to focus on moving forward and tending to my own mental and emotional health. While at work, Lila called, seeking a meeting to see our son. I probed her stability to ensure she wouldn't upset him, and she confirmed that she was stable. I agreed to meet her and her father at 9 a.m. in the park on Saturday, but I insisted my mother come along. I wasn't comfortable meeting Lila alone. Upon seeing her, I decided to limit their contact to 2 hours. She appeared disheveled, having lost a significant amount of weight and devoid of makeup. Instead, she smelled of ivory soap, devoid of the feminine scents I associated with her. Later, I discovered her mother had bathed and dressed her as she couldn't function properly. We continued park meetings for 3 weeks, extending the visits to 4 hours and including Sundays. Although she appeared to be improving each week, I remained concerned about her mental well-being, forbidding her from being alone with our son or keeping him overnight. My mother-in-law eventually grew tired of this arrangement and hired a lawyer to sue for custody. However, since Lila hadn't signed the divorce papers and I was fine waiting to file for divorce in 6 months, her custody lawsuit infuriated me, especially as she sought full custody. I had earlier informed her father of my willingness to eventually split custody 50-50, a notion rejected by her mother. In retaliation, I sought full custody on the grounds of mental incapacity. Update. Seated in the courtroom, my heart pounded in my chest. Across from me, Lila sat calmly, her lawyer by her side. It was challenging to believe that we were here, embroiled in a custody battle for our son. A year ago, we had been a happy family, or so I thought. But now, everything had changed. Lila's lawyer stood up, presenting her case to the judge. She spoke about how Lila was a loving mother, unjustly deprived of her parental rights. She argued that Lila had taken steps to enhance her mental health and was dedicated to our son's well-being. She requested the court to grant Lila full custody of our child. My lawyer rose to counter her arguments, informing the judge of my serious concerns about Lila's mental stability. He presented evidence suggesting she was still grappling with her condition and might not be fit for full-time care of our child. He asked the court to grant me full custody. The judge listened to both sides and then called for a recess to consider his decision. I left the courtroom, feeling overwhelmed and anxious. Leaning against the wall, attempting to calm myself, Lila's father approached. A source of support since the divorce, I was grateful for his presence. He expressed his concern about the situation and informed me that Lila was making progress with therapy and medication. Apparently, she was genuinely committed to getting better. Feeling uncertain, I admitted my dilemma, stating my desire for what's best for our son, while expressing a lack of trust in Lila's ability to care for him independently. Lila's father understood my concerns and suggested working out a joint custody arrangement so that our son could have both parents in his life. After a moment's consideration, I agreed to the idea. Returning to the courtroom, the judge granted joint custody to both Lila and me, with the condition that Lila continue her mental health treatment. Exiting the courtroom, a sense of relief washed over me. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I was willing to try and make it work for the sake of my son. Looking up at the sky, I whispered a silent prayer, hoping that things would improve from this point onward. Update. Lila approached me with a proposition, the idea that we should reconcile and move back in together to try and mend our relationship. As I stood there, gazing at Lila in disbelief, she continued to present her case, attempting to justify her actions and persuade me to take her back. However, her words failed to resonate with me. I could sense anger welling up inside, ready to erupt like a volcano. Without hesitation, I abruptly shut the door in her face. The audacity she displayed by showing up at my door after causing me so much pain was unbelievable. My heart was still recovering from the wounds she had inflicted, and she had the nerve to suggest giving our relationship another chance? It was absurd. As the door closed, I took a deep breath and turned around to find Amber witnessing the entire scene. Oh yes, I've discovered someone who surpasses Lila by 1,000,000 times. Her name's Amber, and she's an absolute rock star. We connected instantly, sparking like fireworks on the 4th of July. Her eyes conveyed empathy and support, and I felt a surge of gratitude towards her. She had been my pillar of strength throughout the ordeal with Lila, and I couldn't envision going through it without her. Amber enveloped me in her arms, offering comfort as I vented my frustrations. She assured me that I had made the right choice and deserved better than someone who had hurt me so deeply. Her presence was soothing, and I felt a renewed determination to move forward and leave the past behind. In the following days, my focus shifted to building a future with Amber. We spent time together, creating memories and embarking on new adventures. Her positivity and zest for life were contagious, and I found myself smiling and laughing more than I had in a long time. With her by my side, the pain of Lila's betrayal gradually faded, and I began to heal. Meanwhile, Lila persisted in attempting to reach out to me, but my decision was firm. I had severed ties with her toxic drama and empty promises. She remained a distant memory, a lesson learned, and a chapter closed in my life. With Amber, I was moving forward. Life was too short to dwell on the past, and I was determined to make the most of every moment with the woman who had captured my heart. With Amber, I had discovered true happiness, and I was prepared to embrace the incredible future that awaited. Cheers!